Okay.
You want the microphone?
Εκλεκτικοί προσκεκλημένοι, φίλοι και συνάδελφοι, κυρίες και κύριοι, καλώς ήρθατε στο Καναδικό
Distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Canadian Institute. My name is Jacques Perreault, and I am the director of the Institute. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you tonight in a most interesting event, the inaugural lecture, Arnopoulos.
Arnopoulos is Professor Emeritus at the Department of Political Science at Concordia University, where he taught world politics and diplomacy for 33 years. Born in Greece, he immigrated to Canada in 1948, completing studies in physics, mathematics, and philosophy at Concordia University in Montreal, but also international affairs and multilateral diplomacy at New York University, and classics and political theory at Columbia University. When Arnopoulos made a generous donation to the Canadian Institute, it was decided to hold an annual event in his honor. Paris's interest in ancient Greek political thought is clearly apparent amongst his numerous publications. I can mention his works on the foreign policies of Plato and Aristotle and their views on war and peace, his study of the genesis of Hellenic international thought, or his reflections on what ancient Greece can teach us on foreign policy. As such, after discussing the possible topics with our cultural manager, Zoe Delibasis, with the assistant director, Jonathan Tomlinson, and with a close friend of the Canadian Institute, journalist and sociologist, Polydefkis Papadopoulos, it was decided to organize a series of events which would make use of classical Greek studies in the analysis of contemporary social phenomena and problems. This evening is the first of these events, and it is entitled What the Ancient Greek World Can Tell Us About Geopolitical Crisis of Today. I will let Polydefkis Papadopoulos, who will be moderating this evening's panel discussion, introduce our keynote speaker, Matthew Sears, and our two other distinguished guests, Professors Maria Gavouneli and Thanos Veremis. On my part, I wish to sincerely thank them all to have accepted our invitation. I am particularly honored that such distinguished members of ELIAMEP have accepted to join us. Of course, my thanks also go to Zoe, Polydefkis, and Jonathan for their help in the organization of this event. Unfortunately, Arnopoulos was not able to be with us this evening, but he wrote a few words. He asked me to read them to you. It is a great honor and pleasure for me that the Canadian Institute in Greece sponsored and convened this first event based on one of my books, On that occasion now, I am indeed sorry I cannot be here with you, attending this session, inaugurating a series of annual meetings to discuss what classical Greek philosophy could teach us presently about analyzing and understanding the current condition in the world as we try to resolve its serious political problems. It is important for us now to know how the thinkers of that time saw and considered their interstate conditions. Unfortunately, classical politics focus primarily on the internal affairs of the polis and do not pay much attention to its external interactions with the other Greek states, let alone the rest of their known Mediterranean world. In my classical studies, I thought this omission was inexcusable in any case, but most important for students of international affairs who could get a better comparative and diachronic picture of international relations throughout the millennium. Such better historical knowledge makes us more cognizant of what we face in world politics. So my thesis may be encapsulated in the sayings, the more things change, the more they are same, or there's nothing new under the sun. As time is precious, I will not take more of it with my comments here, so I will let my colleagues who read the book present their opinions and interactions with each other in this seminar. I hope the audience will get the gist of what I am trying to say in my study of exopolitics as a rare philosophical view of this neglected aspects of politics in ancient Greece and see its similarity with current affairs as with all other historical periods in the world. Well, thank you very much, Paris Arnopoulos, for this. And now it's time to pass the microphone to Polydefkis. Thank you all for coming.
I want to add that this event is also streaming by Earth News, so a wider audience is participating. And just to give a few more explanations, when about a year ago, myself also happened to take part in some meetings here in this institute about the ways that this general sponsorship of of Paris Arnopoulos could be used. The first idea that came to us was to form something different to show that the study of classical Greeks, as this institute does, and so many others, is not only about a timeless admiration of a glorious past, but it can be practically useful even today. The second consideration was that this combination of classical studies and modern reality, in what field it should be done out of all possible. It could be in relation to art, aesthetics, culture, modern interest in ancient languages, application to today's moral, ethical dilemmas, technology, uses of governance, politics, or geopolitics. And finally, the last one, geopolitics, and the usefulness of classical thought, this combination, but also the history of ancient Greece, chose us by itself as a topic for the start for this annual circle of Arnopoulos seminars, due to, of course, this such a critical actuality that we live. It should be clarified that when the topic of today, what the ancient Greeks could tell us, ancient Greek and Greeks can tell us about geopolitical crisis of today, this title was chosen a few months ago. The issue that dominated the discussions on international relations was, of course, the war on Ukraine and the crisis and distributions that have been created with a global impact for the new West-East rivalry, where, in addition to the rupture with Russia, there is also, of course, the question of the West's and especially USA's rivalities to China. A well-known work that refers to these issues, as probably you might know, is the American academic Graham Allison's book, The Thucydides Trap, which is inspired by the work of the considered founder, not of history, but of the study of international relations, that it's Thucydides, and his work, of course, on the Peloponnesian War. In a while, during the discussion, probably the speakers will refer to this book. And of course, it's in the last period, and especially these days, that the world's attention and anxiety has turned to the Middle East, where, of course, crises are different, maybe, of a different type, but that doesn't mean that the great importance of all the aforementioned remain important. It should be also noted that one of the motivations, the inspirations for choosing this first topic was one of the works of Paris Arnopoulos, Exopolitiki, the foreign policy of ancient Greeks. It's being published first in English in 1999 by Nova Science publication, and in Greek in 2001 by this book by Leader Books. In this, he explains that ancient Greeks did not develop a comprehensive theory and practice for what in their time would be foreign policy, despite the existence of many colonies, alliances, wars between cities, etc., in relation to the perfecting methods and ideas for the operation of the city, of polis. However, Professor Arnopoulos highlights in his book many elements from the history of these city-states, as well as from the thought and works of philosophers, writers, orators, such as Aristotle, Plato, Herodotus, Thucydides, Isocrates, Demosthenes, related with what international relations are today and how they work. You heard before some thoughts of Mr. Arnopoulos. Now, let me introduce to you the speakers. First of all, the key speaker, Professor Matthew Sears. He's professor in the Department of Classics and Ancient History in the University of New Brunswick. It's a small but very historical university in Canada. He holds also a PhD in classics from Cornell University. His research interests are about ancient Greek and Roman history, Greek and Latin historiography, ancient warfare and society. That fits a lot to this discussion. There are a lot of references about his books and his writings in publications like Washington Post, the Global Mail, the Canadian big newspaper, Time Magazine, etc. His last book, published, I think, this year, Matthew, it's his Sparta and the Commemoration of War. But in 2019, he wrote another book, Understanding Greek Warfare. Mr. Sears, among others, make us optimist because he represents a new wave, a new breed of Hellenistic scholars with a modern discourse, adaptation to newer interests, being living proof of the continuation of interest in classical studies, but also their modern usefulness. And his particular title of his speech is "Have we learned anything? Thucydides on the inevitability of war." It's a very challenging title. And από εδώ και πέρα θα πω, επίσης θα παρουσιάσω στα ελληνικά, ότι όταν σκεφτήκαμε να κάνουμε αυτή την εκδήλωση...
Let me switch to Greek. When we were designing this event, we thought it would be very good to invite a research institute that deals with international relations. So that's why we thought it would be best to invite the one that is the oldest, the most multifaceted in Greece. So we're talking about ELIAMEP, the Hellenic Institute for European and Foreign Policy. So now they used to have a different title, but the acronym remains the same. There are two people from ELIAMEP today, Mrs. Maria Gavouneli, and towards the end of the table, we have Mr. Thanos Erenis. Mrs. Maria Gavouneli is a general director at ELIAMEP. She is a professor at the Law School of the University of Athens, and she's also a member of many associations. She taught at Perreault, at the law school at Perreault. Let me say that her PhD, as far as I know, I didn't know in the past, but I found out that her PhD was on environmental pollution from offshore installations. And yesterday she was able to talk about oceans because there was the Oceans Conference held in Greece. And we also have with us, it's a great pleasure, Mr. Thanos Merenis. He is a vice president of ELIAMEP, the professor emeritus at ECPA, the National University of Athens. He has taught in many universities outside Greece. And he also taught at Pantheon University. He was my professor. I was very fortunate, and I'm very happy to be with him today. So, Matthew, the floor is yours.
Still Papadopoulos, Polydefkis, and I'm grateful for everyone for being here and for this invitation and for my fellow speakers who have agreed to speak with us tonight, and I'm humbled. And so I will just begin. And I also want to mention that this talk is not only possible because of the generous funding of Professor Arnopoulos, and I must say that I'm humbled and I'm honored to have been invited to speak at this inaugural event. But it's also largely inspired by his fascinating and ambitious book, Exopolitics. In this book, Professor Arnopoulos demonstrates what ancient Greek authors had to say about the sphere of interstate politics and international relations, and what they still have to say about our present situation, which, as I'm sure you all recognize, is by no means free of conflict and war between and sometimes within states and nations. I agree that these Greek authors still speak to us with ideas and insights to which we should pay attention. Where Professor Arnopoulos' book culminated in the analysis of Plato and Aristotle, after masterfully surveying the works of earlier thinkers, I will focus this evening on Thucydides, or Thucydides, whom many credit for the invention of the discipline of international relations. Thucydides boasted that he meant his work to be a possession for all time, and I think he succeeded. Our gathering here this evening to think about his words is ample proof of that. Yet while we still read and ponder and discuss Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, I want us to consider what lessons it has to teach us, whether we have learned any of those lessons, and whether those lessons have any bearing on the current sorry state of our world, in which people continue to fight and too many continue to suffer and die because of international relations or exopolitics we still have not gotten right. Before Thucydides, there was Herodotus, whom Cicero called the father of history. There we go. International relations are indeed central to Herodotus's historiae, his investigation or inquiry. In the proem, he states that his motivation for conducting an investigation was to ensure that great and wondrous deeds done by Greeks and barbarians alike might not be forgotten in time, but most of all to explain why the two peoples, the Greeks and the Persians, fought each other. Herodotus conceives of the Persian Wars as the outcome of the first large-scale international political and military exchange between Greeks, based in Europe, but also in thriving and long-standing communities in Ionia and other regions we would now consider Eastern, and various Western Asian peoples, starting with Croesus and the Lydians and continuing to Xerxes' empire. Though the first extended work of prose we have in the Greek language, Herodotus drew upon many poetic themes in publishing the results of his investigation. As would have been dear to the heart of Homer's warriors, Herodotus's work is one of memorialization. What good are marvelous deeds, and what benefit do they convey to those performing them if they are forgotten? All of Achilles' feats on the battlefield would have amounted to nothing if no lasting record of those feats existed. Herodotus also mirrored tragedy in his account of the mighty brought low, of great leaders pushing too far and thereby summoning the gods' jealousy and retribution. Herodotus's account of why the two peoples fought each other, though a vital and irreplaceable source for historians like me, is a gripping and dramatic read, as it is a moralizing warning to those who would throw their weight around and play the part of Xerxes lashing the Hellespont and digging a canal through Athos. Surely the Athenians, themselves at the height of their imperial power in the 430s when these histories were composed, and about to spark a war that would end in their defeat and humiliation, were Herodotus's intended audience. Why the two peoples fought each other became a preoccupation for many of Herodotus's successors. A century and more after the Persian Wars, the Athenians disagreed amongst themselves about why a state should go to war and against whom. Isocrates, drawing on the Persian Wars as his inspiration, argued that the Greeks should join together as Greeks and forge I'm going to try to put up Isocrates here. There we go. If without the picture of Isocrates, I might as well not speak. They should join together as Greeks and forge a pan-Hellenic coalition against the Persians, who are not Greeks, and therefore a much better target for Greek military action, in contrast to the Greeks' propensity to fight amongst themselves. When the Athenians seemed unwilling or unable to effect such a coalition, Isocrates turned to Philip of Macedonia, whose military might and territorial resources rendered him a possible Greek unifying force against a common enemy. And I suggest you all go to the Cycladic Museum if you haven't already and see the results of that effort. Demosthenes, on the other hand, was more parochial in his outlook, valuing Athenian independence as a polis and hegemony over others, and encouraged the Athenians to bolster their citizen military forces in order to contain Philip's growing power. Events would play out more along the lines envisioned, or at least accepted by Isocrates, but only after Philip crushed Athens and its allies on the battlefield at Chaeronea in 338. Like Herodotus, Isocrates and Demosthenes crafted their speeches and pamphlets in such a way as to spur their audience to reflection and action. Not themselves historians, these orators nevertheless derived lessons from how and why the two peoples fight each other. Herodotus's histories provided them with the raw material for how the Athenians could best engage in exopolitics. Before these 4th century orators, Herodotus's most immediate successor was Thucydides. Where Herodotus was the father of history, Thucydides has been called the father of political science and the first international relations theorist. Thucydides famously rejects the entertaining tales found in the work of Herodotus and others, instead offering a supposedly cold and sober analysis of how states interact and fight wars. The Peloponnesian War serving as an illustrative case study for similar events bound to happen again and again. Since human nature, or the human thing, to anthropinon, is fixed, Thucydides' work stands as a ktema sia, a possession for all time. While I agree with Thucydides for the most part concerning human nature, what lessons does he have for our current situation? If nothing new under the sun, if the more things change, they stay the same, as Professor Arnopoulos began our evening with. Have we learned those lessons? And if so, how, if at all, can we put them into practice? First, Thucydides seems to tell us that war is inevitable, especially when a rising power threatens the position of an established power. He says that though the affair of Epidamnus and the siege of Potidæa were the stated causes of the war between the Athenians and Peloponnesians, the real cause was the growth of Athenian power and the fear this caused in Sparta. Many examples in history bear out this general scheme. The unification of Germany and the expansion of its power at the end of the 19th century, for instance, threatened the traditional balance of power and made the First World War perhaps unavoidable, at least according to the system that prevailed at the time. Graham Allison of Harvard University, as Polydefkis has mentioned already, uses the term the Thucydides trap for the inevitability of war when a new power threatens an established one. and has charted many instances in which this trap plays out as if it were a rule of international relations. Allison applies the Thucydides trap paradigm to the rising tensions between the United States and China, two powers that might, alas, be destined for war, as the title of his book suggests. If this is one of Thucydides' lessons, then it's a grim one indeed. I would challenge the great historian, however, or at least many interpretations of the great historian. As scholars such as Donald Kagan have pointed out, Thucydides was a revisionist historian. Not only did he represent a contrast to the entertaining historians like Herodotus, whose works reek of myth in his poignant formulation, he also stood against the popular perception of the past. His most famous revisionist passage is a digression on the tyrannicides Harmodius and Aristogiton, whom most Athenians credited with ending the Pisistratid tyranny in Athens and paving the way to liberty and democracy. Thucydides takes on this account to argue that only the less important of the two ruling Pisistratid brothers was killed, Hipparchus, and that the remaining brother Hippias ruled for several more years and much more harshly than before. Furthermore, Hipparchus was killed not by a daring act in the service of freedom, but because of a lover's quarrel and personal animosities. The tyrant Hippias comes off pretty well in Thucydides' telling, calm and collected in the face of violence, while the murderers look rash and incompetent, exhibiting the behavior of the basest mob, hardly a ringing endorsement of democracy. All right, there we go. The Peloponnesian Wars' Inevitability is another of Thucydides' revisions to the popular account. Another version of events can be found in other sources, particularly as preserved by Plutarch in his Life of Pericles. Thucydides was obviously fond of Pericles and presented him as the leading citizen of Athens, who gave the best advice concerning how the war should be fought and the Athenian Empire preserved. Plutarch, by contrast, preserves a tradition that reveals Pericles to be corrupt, in league with the great sculptor Phidias, who was accused of embezzling money from the building project on the Acropolis. Plutarch's Pericles eggs on the Spartans and provokes the war in order to distract from his personal scandals. Heaven help us if a certain corrupt politician has the nuclear codes. Aristophanes, Thucydides and Pericles' contemporary, suggests in his comedy Acarnanians that Periclean policies such as the Megarian decree, which banned tiny megara from using Athenian markets and thus threatened to starve the Megarians, were both draconian and responsible for the war breaking out. By making the war inevitable, though, Thucydides absolves his hero of responsibility for a conflict that was bad for Greece as a whole, and Athens in particular, as it would turn out. Perhaps there is some hope for us after all. There are things we can do and avoid doing if we seek to avoid war between rival powers. I know that this is bound to be a controversial topic, but were there ways to prevent Russia's invasion of Ukraine long before such an invasion was even contemplated? And even if President Putin is at this point the obvious aggressor for which he should be condemned, could NATO have acted less provocatively in Eastern Europe? Or do rival interests in this region make war, perhaps one even worse than the one we are seeing now, unavoidable? Perhaps less controversially, while the Third Reich was undoubtedly the aggressor during the Second World War, the punitive Treaty of Versailles certainly played a role in Hitler's rise to power and all but guaranteed that the Great War did not really end on Armistice Day in 1918. Another of Thucydides' supposed lessons for us can be classed under the category of realism or realpolitik. The idea that ethics and morality do not matter in international relations, but only self-interest. States and the people in them do not act out of a sense of right or wrong, but based on what is expedient. The summative statement of this principle is found in the mouths of the Athenians in the Melian dialogue, who tell the Melians that it is a timeless law that the strong do what they can, while the weak suffer what they must. Whatever we think of the justice in a great power like Athens crushing a weak power like Melos, which simply wanted to remain neutral in the war, that the Melians ignored this law while hoping in the gods or the honor of the Spartans led to the island being captured by the Athenians and the men of Melos being killed while the women and children were sold into slavery. A realist perspective similar to that frequently attributed to Thucydides is expressed by Thrasymachus at the beginning of Plato's Republic, when he bellows at Socrates that justice is no more than the interest of the stronger. Of course, just because Thucydides' Athenians make certain arguments in the Melian dialogue does not mean Thucydides agrees with them. Thucydides saw the end of the war, but died before he finished writing his final 2 books, including what would have been his account of the fall of Athens. Hunter Rawlings and others have reconstructed this lost section of text to argue that the fall of Athens very likely would have recalled episodes like the sack of Melos. Thucydides' successor Xenophon does narrate Athens' capitulation to the Spartans and explicitly portrays the Athenians as terrified they were bound to suffer the fate they had inflicted on others, the Melians in particular. In the Melian dialogue, the Melians encourage the Athenians to behave justly to ensure that they themselves do not suffer injustice in the future when they, as these things typically go, lose their own position of power and find themselves at someone else's mercy. It is difficult, therefore, to read the Athenian arguments in the Melian dialogue as instructions for how to behave in the international sphere. We can build on these points if we consider the Mytilenean debate earlier in Thucydides' work, through which the Athenians consider whether to kill the men and enslave the women and children of Mytilene, which had revolted from the Athenian Empire. In that debate, Thucydides' apparent arch-villain Cleon, a notorious demagogue, argues that the Mytileneans should be treated as the Melians would be a decade later. Cleon, however, does not argue from a position of expediency that the Mytileneans should be punished because this would be to the greatest advantage for the Athenians. Instead, he argues on the principle of justice, that the Mytileneans had betrayed the Athenians, who had always treated the Mytileneans well, and such an affront demands retribution. It is the other speaker, Diodotus, who most think presents the attitudes of Thucydides himself, that argues that showing mercy to the Mytileneans would be the expedient thing to do. Diodotus leaves open the possibility that harsh punishment might indeed be just in this case, but it would not help the Athenians at all, nor would it preserve the empire. Instead, the fate of the Mytileneans would only encourage other rebellious allies to fight it out to the very end, rather than to come to any sort of settlement or truce. There are hints in Diodotus' speech, though, that he, and by extension Thucydides, might think that showing mercy is the right thing to do. But an argument based on expediency is deployed in order to convince the gathered Athenians to do the right thing by thinking it is the advantageous thing. At the very beginning of his address, Diodotus criticizes the Athenian people for not appreciating being told the truth, instead making it necessary for effective speakers to deceive them in order to win a debate. Are we then to believe that Diodotus proceeds to speak openly and honestly right after he says that good speakers trying to do good things have to lie? I don't think so. In the end, I think that Thucydides' actual position on international relations is that justice is expedient, that there is no contradiction between doing what is right and wrong, doing what is right and doing what works in one's advantage. If the Athenians had behaved justly, then perhaps they would have not threatened Spartan power and found themselves in a war they ended up losing. And if they had treated the Melians and others well, they would not have had to fear destruction at the end of the war, a fate from which they were only narrowly saved by the Spartans. If Thucydides really does think that war is inevitable, he seems to think that there are good and bad ways to fight a war, and that justice should be pursued, even if only to pursue one's self-interest. Other scholars, such as Mary Nichols, have also challenged the traditional realist reading of Thucydides. Is this then a cause for optimism, that exopolitics can be a vehicle for justice? That's a repeat slide anyway, you don't need to see it. This Thucydides. Let me conclude by returning to Thucydides' claim that his work is a possession for all time. I didn't have the guts to write that in my latest book, but maybe the next one. Since human nature means that things like or very similar to the Peloponnesian War will keep happening, and thus his detailed analysis will prove useful in all times and places for those who wish to understand what's going on around them. There are certainly many things going on around us as we gather here this evening. The war in Ukraine, continuing slaughter in Gaza and the West Bank and Lebanon, which increasingly looks likely to ignite a regional war or worse. Far-right movements gaining strength and securing electoral victories in Europe and North America, all of which raises the specter of more wars in more places. It is by now long apparent that Francis Fukuyama was wrong, that there was no end of history with the fall of the Soviet Union. History continues in all its fury. I have tried to be optimistic this evening by calling into question just how inescapable the Thucydides trap is, and as Polydefkis pointed out yesterday, there are Greek scholars also working on this rebuttal to this paradigm, and suggesting that Thucydides thinks justice is important, should be pursued, and can lead to practical advantages in the service of self-interest besides. Can we then apply Thucydides' analysis to our world in order to understand it better, to know how to act, and to make justice a more likely outcome? I am not sure. I agree with Thucydides that human nature is more or less fixed. This is one of the reasons the Greeks can still speak to us today and why we find their works of literature and art so moving. They thought about many of the things we still think about and struggled with many of the things with which we still struggle. Unfortunately, while Thucydides thinks his work will help us understand the world and its exopolitics, I'm less sure that he thinks we can do anything about it. The great logos-ergon dichotomy, or word versus deed, found throughout Thucydides' work would seem to be operative here. In word, or logos, we can understand what's going on and why people and states do what they do. But in deed, or ergon, human nature may be so fixed and intransigent that people and states are going to do what they're going to do regardless of how many people read and understand Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. Instead of those who are ignorant of history are doomed to repeat it, it might rather be those who know history are doomed to watch powerlessly as it unfolds again and again, human nature being what it is. I hope this is not the case. I genuinely do. And maybe it isn't. As I've already said, I think Thucydides was wrong and intentionally misleading about the inevitability of war. And in any case, I agree with him that justice is important, and I really do think he argues this, and that regardless of human nature, it is important for us to pursue it. That might even do us some practical good. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Matthew. Να εξηγήσω ότι η αναφορά που έκανε...
Let me explain that the reference made by Mr. Sears is that some months ago a new book is in Greece, and it goes against the Thucydides prep. It's by Professor Plakine Stringers, and they conclude that there is no historical rule that inevitably leads to war, despite the situation. Mrs. Gavouneli, you have the floor. Professor? So Mr. Varemis will now take the floor.
I think one should begin by examining the sense of time and how the Greeks of antiquity looked at time as opposed to what we do today. I think since they hadn't yet gone through Christianity, which tends to look at time as a factor of improvement and a factor of gaining more than losing. They saw time as a repetition of events, really, a repetition, for one thing, of seasons. And since seasons repeat themselves, so do events. And events do repeat themselves in a society which is closed within itself. So my feeling is that why the Greeks of antiquity looked at current affairs rather than the distant past, which we do today more so. We want to understand why Israel fights with the Palestinians, and we look at their past history to understand why they do so. In antiquity, there's a continuous interest in current affairs, and especially our Thucydides is very much involved in current affairs. I think all Greek historians that I can remember, one being Herodotus, which looked at the other side of the fence of the Orient, but as it evolved in his time. And then Xenophon, who also dealt with current affairs in his own experiences rather, in history. So my feeling is that when we focus on what goes on today alone, it's because we expect that it will happen again, and therefore do not have to look for a different ending of the story. We know more or less how it's going to develop. Thucydides believes that human nature is immutable, that it doesn't change. And I think it's probably the only thing that he looks into more so than other factors. But there are many factors in the development of a city-state, let's say, which is the world of antiquity. Each world containing just about everything there is to contain was in the city-state. Ethics and justice, which are synonymous in a way. Justice varies, but it follows the ethics of a society. All these things tend to become part of a universe that each Athenian city-state encapsulated within itself. Justice is part of ethics, as I said, of a society, but the more providential it is, the more the possibility of avoiding the negative outcome of changing circumstances between adversaries of different military capacity. Here we have the example of Sparta, which was more or less a military autocracy, depended for its well-being, for its food, let's say, on the Ilotes, whatever the translation is, on the Ilotes of Messenia, and they made good their state of captivity, and the Spartans would persist in the art of warfare, and therefore became the most notorious, the most capable country in warfare for many a century. However, even the Spartan advantage in warfare was reversed by the innovative Theban phalanx, and then Thebes themselves, or itself, lost the war in Cheronia because of the superior Macedonian phalanx. So there is a development, there is an increase of skill. There are many things that do change. It's not only human nature which does not change. Human nature may not change, but so many other things around human nature do change. And this change is what these countries that did not anticipate change or did not think of change at all neglected. Hence, we come at the state of affairs of late antiquity, where Macedonia, because of the discovery of gold in Pangeo as well. I mean, let's not forget the money behind the story, but also because they put it to good use in developing their warfare system. system of war, system of fighting against other city-states. Are the ethical codes of different societies comparable? Are they immutable? I think not. And this is what makes our present history in Europe vis-a-vis the Russia or vis-a-vis the Middle East so difficult to understand, mainly because there's so much variety and change in these in this world of ours of today. But we do know that human nature, if human nature is immutable, it's probably the only thing which is immutable. I doubt that it is, because there are so many different views of the world. If you compare antiquity with modern times, for instance, there is a feature of modern times which antiquity did not anticipate at all, and that is the value of the human factor. In other words, the value of humanity itself. This is not to say that the ancient Greeks did not value humanity. They did, of course, and they did value all the doings of humanity. But human rights, for instance, are nowhere to be found in antiquity. There are no human rights anywhere. This is a new development. And those who attempt to undermine human rights are being, will have to pay a price for that. The present war between Russia and the Ukraine is very much telling of this tendency on the part of Russia to completely overrun the rights of Ukraine, and so many other examples. Now, what remains to be found is why did Athens, in spite of its advantage in many different fields, in commerce, in cosmopolitanism, in the rule of the seas, how did it manage to lose the war against a rather provincial power, which was Sparta? A provincial power, very good at war, but in very few other things. The question remains, is it because Sparta suddenly became aware of the rise of Athens and the human nature of its neighbors that looks for more rather than less? Who knows? We still have not given a satisfactory answer to that question. But in spite of Thucydides' concentration on the immutability of human nature, we'll find out, I hope, in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you both for your very inspiring and very, I like the approach kind of presentation. And thank you, Professor Perreault, for these comments. Well, I come from a different perspective. I'm no historian. I have the usual sort of classical background in this country, and once upon a time I wanted to become an archaeologist. But I am a lawyer, and I am in fact an international lawyer. That means that I come from the perspective of a positivist kind of approach that says there are certain rules and these rules need to be obeyed. but at the same time, I operate within this very unstable world environment. So I'm very far from your typical lawyer where, you know, the book says so and we have to do it. The idea of going by the book in international law does not exist. We write the book as we go along, which really means that we move away from this more or less stable, should I call it, environment of Thucydides and the Greeks and the Athenian democracy and the Spartan autocracy. Reading through the lines with modern lens today, one has the feeling that the world moves around in this constant loop. And that's why actually Thucydides talks about the human nature as being there, stable, perennial. It goes on and on and on and on and never finishes. My world, today's world, is actually a world in permanent motion. It is a world that is by definition unstable. I usually call it primitive to my students. And I explain that the nearest example I can use, the nearest image I can produce for them is actually a tribe that has just come out of the cave and they're about to fight it out. And that's pretty much the situation of the world today. What have we done to avoid this fighting it out business? In fact, that might be a fighting it out business that repeats itself every day. Well, we have relied on what you would call justice, this idea of how we embrace principles and how we use those principles to create our new world and build upon it for the future. We have decided in the aftermath of the Second World War, which of course means that we have decided after the disaster, not before, but that's human nature. We have decided that we really did not want to go that mutual destruction mode again. And the result we came up with was this tentative idea of a world that is horizontal. It has little blocks, and the little blocks are the states. And in this horizontal primitive world, we have decided to operate on the basis of a lie, blatant lie. And that lie is the equality of states, sovereign equality of states. We all know we are not equal. We all know that the states that exist today do not have the same capacities, the same capabilities, the same wealth, the same will. They do have different characteristics and different ideas. And yet, these states, against their own self-interest, therein lies your discussion about the million dilemma, they have decided to restrict, restrain, constrict, contain their power. And if that was a rational choice for the smaller states, that was certainly not a rational choice for the bigger ones, isn't it? And yet they did it. Why have they done it? For the greater good. The greater good encompasses self-interest. So the idea is that at the end of the day, this containment of their powers would actually yield perhaps the stability that the system lacks. So go back to our building blocks, go back to these little blocks that wander about the place. They are connected between themselves with the little links of a chain. Have you ever tried to put a chain and make it stable? It's not done, isn't it? A chain always plays along. These little links always move. These are the rules of international law. And the chain really helps to contain the system. Block A moves up, block B moves down, block C moves sideways, and the chain really brings them back, or tries to bring them back, and in trying to come up with this state of balance that is never there. The only reason that these blocks do not break the chain and move away is simply because they have agreed on those general principles that make our world today. And you can describe them as justice or equity, or the idea of this commonality of cause. Every one of those may be liable to break the chain and move away. Every one of those at a particular point in time may actually attempt to do so. Some of them are doing it as we speak. And yet you see immediately how the world community has actually tried to come up and chain them back. The reaction of the world community against Russia at this point is done not because there is any anti-Russian feeling or anything like that, but because here you have a blatant breach of the rules. So if you allow the blatant breach here, there's your Mytilene conundrum. If you allow that blatant breach here, then the same would happen next time around, and yes, somebody else or another state might attempt to do that. One of the reasons why this country, for instance, is very clear as of its choice. How do we convert this inherent imbalance into a stable system? And incidentally, our system today has lasted for 80 years without major war, not without war at all, because as Thucydides said, this is human nature, but without major war. Okay, so something is correct in that kind of arrangement. Our architecture seems to be working at some point. But as I said, this being an inherently unstable system, we always feel the tremors. We're always on the brink of something. We're always just about to fall. We haven't managed not to fall up to now. We might fall tomorrow morning. We might fall this evening, for all I know. Because again, that is human history, and you never go how to move along. Final words. Thucydides seems to operate in a world where you do have conflict, which is bipolar. Within the Greek parameters, it is a conflict between Athens and Sparta. The Athenian Empire, which started as the Athenian Common and developed into an empire. That's another discussion about the use of power, isn't it? Yeah. And we also have the autocratic regime in Sparta, which, as Professor Veremi says, is really quite provincial. It's stuck, it's closed, it has not moved over the centuries. Athens has created these wonderful things along the way. And for centuries, Sparta has done the exact same thing, preparing for war, with nothing else to show. So, you know, there's a certain stability in that particular system. I'm not so sure whether we want this kind of stability that is so close to stagnation. I, for one, would be terribly bored, but there you go. But this is a bipolarity within Greece, if you like. The idea of this common Greekness, the sense of being part of the Hellenic nation, that comes later on. It's not immediate in the classic era. And there's also another bipolarity, which is the external bipolarity. And there we're talking about this Athenian, this Hellenic kind of spirit, the commonality of Greeks, as opposed to the Persians. one is tempted to look at it with modern eyes and say, okay, we are certainly the Western Athenians. There's no question about that. Who is the other side? It used to be the Soviet Union. It might be Russia today. It could be China tomorrow. Are we destined to end up with this kind of balance of powers? I would argue yes. Why? Because our domestic arrangements might not be stagnant, but we are actually constrained on this planet. Our world is finite. And because it's finite, and there's no question that there has to be a discussion about power and who wields that power, and in which way you wield that power. What we have attempted to do in international law, in the United Nations system, in the human rights protection system that we live through nowadays, is actually contain that power and never allow any state to move away from that balancing act. So if a state moves towards autocracy, human rights protection would stop it from moving there. So you don't need to go to war to stop it, because you have these millions of small and bigger change drawing it back. We have tried to make a system of prevention, preventing war, by actually diffusing the quest for power, because the balance of power at the end of the day is actually a closed, finite system. And that's where things happen. There are external elements that occasionally play a role in this balancing act. Technology is certainly one of those, be it the Macedonian phalanx or what else, or AI, for all I know today. But then again, these things are also the product of human brain, of human mind, isn't it? They don't come from outer space. They don't come from God. We have created them. I would argue, I would agree with you at the end of the day. I would agree saying that Thucydides understood that here you might end up being the practical man that he was. Being actually, you remember, he was a general himself. He was a politician himself. I mean, he was not writing from his ivory tower. He has been involved in these kind of things. So he knew how the system worked. Nonetheless, he knew. So he knew what he did right and what he did wrong. So I think that he understood that the system has to be stabilized. And in order to be stabilized, you would need that effect of justice. You would need this tendering process that would actually cut down on the reality, the cruelty of war, and that at the end of the day would avoid war. Because war means destruction. And it's not always your enemy that's going to be destroyed. It might be yourself. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gavouneli. Now, let's proceed with, first of all, if there are questions, any or short interventions inside the room, because there are people maybe that will ask through Zoom, but we'll find out. So, yes.
It's an interesting thing I like to share.
You want to raise? It's possible? It's okay.
President Bush, the younger, said something that reminded us of what the Athenians said to the village. If you're not with us, you're against us. There is a nice example of how we mention
one of my favorite Onion headlines of all time was George W. Bush enraptures crowd with an extemporaneous discussion of Virgil's minor works. And I think the chance that he read Thucydides is similar too. But George W. Bush, this isn't accidental, in fact, this connection, because the neoconservative movement, they were called the Vulcans. So Condoleezza Rice, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, this entire group that was driving the foreign policy of the Bush administration were the intellectual allies and often direct students of Thucydidean scholars like Donald Kagan. And so they applied the very, I think, simplistic realist view of Thucydides to their foreign policy, which I think, as we've talked, I think is a misreading of Thucydides. But when you see resemblances like that, certainly those around Bush had read their Thucydides, I think wrongly, but certainly took that approach. And I think, like the Athenians, took it from the perspective of very focused on the present, that the American empire is so unimaginably powerful compared to anyone else on earth, that it would never have to care about another power breaking international law the way the United States did when it invaded Iraq. And so I think that's one of the lessons too, that if there is anything that's a constant, it's change and disruption and things. And so for Bush to say that kind of thing with the kind of arrogance that the Athenians do at Milos, 50 years from now, who knows? We might wish that we had been more insistent on following those, staying part of that chain. So thank you.
Interestingly enough, there was a reaction to that, because the US went ahead in Iraq by themselves without the blessings of the Security Council, because they failed to get the blessings of the Security Council. And yet, for the first time, you might recall that discussion with old Europe actually saying, no, you simply cannot do that. Because, well, old Europe and new Europe, you remember that? And the new Europe at the time was not so much Britain. It was actually the newly erupting and new emerging states of Eastern Europe, who were looking actually towards the US for support rather than old Europe, because they felt that power was there and they better attach themselves to that powerful ally rather than the one that was closest to them. So again, you do have this pulling of change all over the place, and the rattling of chains all over the place. So we have seen the results, of course. You know, the results were never clear-cut in this way. And I think it reinforces the argument of this balancing act. It's not a simple black and white world anymore. It never was. No.
I wonder to what extent the lessons of antiquity can work today. I'm not sure what these lessons are to begin with. And the other thing is immutable human nature. Is it immutable, I wonder? I think not. I think human nature changes. It may be nature, but nature itself is really after us right now. And it will reappear with a vengeance soon enough. So I'm not sure that human nature does not change. For one thing, many different things have happened. I mean, as we did not anticipate them to occur. China itself is an entirely new experience, isn't it? I mean, here is a communist state which thrives on capitalism and is doing well so far, with certain problems here and there, but it's still a unique development in our world. Russia is probably more in line with its past. It hasn't changed very much. It has it rid itself from communism as an ideology, but not its long-drawn economic thinking. Goes on and on thinking of what to do next. And after a lot of thinking, what do? They attack Ukraine. I mean, that is no surprise coming from the country of czars and then Soviet Union leaders. A very, very predictable state up to now. Not doing well in economics, certainly behind China, and selling its own natural products, such as sources of energy, which is what the good Lord gave them, and they do sell that product very successfully so far. I think probably the most surprising state is the European Union, if we call it a state. Why? Because in the past was a variety of states fighting each other for various reasons. Now it's more or less rid of that stage. It hasn't come to the point of agreeing on everything yet, but at least it has gone a long way in changing since we last remember, which was the Second World War. So here we are in the European Union with many surprises in its sleeves. We'll see if this goes on or if it has a limit in changing.
Thank you. Thanks. You all spoke of human nature, both then and now. I was surprised there was no mention of the word greed. I wonder if you can explore, was it explored back then, the human need for greed, wanting more, wanting what the others have?
The ancient Greeks had a word, pleonexia, which meant grasping for more. And so there's one of my favorite incidents in the Peloponnesian War is when the Athenians have captured or trapped hundreds of Lacedaemonians or Spartans on the island of Sphacteria near Pylos, and the Spartans are ready to make peace. And in fact, according to the original ways, the reasons they went to war, which was just to make Sparta acknowledge that they're an empire and they're here to stay, this was exactly, they would have won. Athens would have won if they had made peace with Sparta. But the demagogic leader at the time, Cleon, urged them. He's like, we've got them now. We can get more and more and more. And Thucydides describes this as pleonexia, as grasping. And that's what continues the war eventually to disaster. So they absolutely understood and wrestled with that fact of human nature. And it was the Athenians at that particular moment that were the paragons of it.
The reason for their final defeat: exceeding the limits, hubris and nemesis, but not just hubris and nemesis. It was also the idea of overexpanding your resources, moving beyond your capabilities, and having lost an understanding of the realities in the field. Part of it, and that's another discussion, but I'm sure you're more capable of doing in this respect, and certainly much more prepared to do, would be whether the Athenian democracy was actually killing itself through the demagoguery, the discussion of opening up, what you might call today populism. So move that into today's reality, and suddenly, oops, there are certain things that, smell, look, and sound very familiar.
Speech. I must explain that all people that are on Zoom, they can also write down or chat in the chat questions or remarks. Okay, we can also take this kind of questions.
Hopefully my wife is not listening to me right now. So from what I understand, first of all, thank you very much for your talks, for the lecture. It's always interesting for a Greek Canadian to, well, you found my Achilles heel, and it's obviously Greeks of antiquity. So I have 4 professors in front of me. Is that correct? 3, plus a lawyer. So I knew you were, because you said my students, so I knew there were 4. I made a promise after graduating from my 3rd university. I said I will never again go to another class. And here I am again on a Thursday night in front of 4 professors. So life is strange, very strange. Okay. Sorry. So my question has to do with this. First of all, I'd like to say, because we are comparing Greeks of antiquity with what's happening today with Ukraine or with Israel and Palestine. There's a great saying from a philosopher who stated, he who does not study history is condemned. That's the word he used. Is condemned to make the same mistakes, right? It was George Santayana, a great American. If the Americans are getting into philosophy, life is strange, as I say. So this history, that we are studying history because we don't want to make the same mistakes. Greeks of antiquity, there's a huge gap, because Professor Veremis mentioned about the timelines. The Greeks of Troy with the Greeks of, let's say, Pericles or Megas Alexandros, we're talking a gap of 3,000 years. Did not Greeks also learn from the mistakes of the past? So that's my first question. The second question has to do with the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, which is an aggression. I can compare it. Again, I'm not into your field. I'm a biologist. I have a degree. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. But I can equate it to what happened with Troy, where they were all Greeks. So this thing about Greeks going into Troy, it's not true. Homer never mentions Greeks as a word. They were all Greeks. So they wanted, you mentioned that they wanted more. It had to do with economy. It had to do with many different things. It was war. So probably Russia and Ukraine, I can equate that to Troy. Again, I'm not into your field. The second part, which has to do with Israel and Palestine, no, this is totally different. We're talking about a piece of land that both people wanted. Okay, so my question has to do, again, if we're comparing the past with what's happening today, and as I said, Greeks of antiquity, we're talking a gap of 3,000, 4,000 years, because I come from Limnos. So as you know, Polydefkis was built 4,000 BC. Okay, 1,000 years before Troy. Did not Greeks of that part of antiquity, did they not learn from their ancestors? Thank you. I'm going to write a book.
I think that one of the main reasons why someone like Herodotus was writing his history was to try to get his fellow Greeks to do that. And so he begins with these mythological stories of, including the abduction of Helen, so the Trojan War, of people stealing women back and forth as a sort of, tit for tat thing. And then he talks about how the Greeks unjustly escalated things by invading Troy. And then he goes on and talks about how the Persians unjustly escalated things by invading Greece. And he's doing it to convince the Athenians not to unjustly expand or exacerbate or enslave as the Persians had others. And so I think, yes, I think they did try to do that. And Herodotus, I believe, would be dismayed that his audience didn't take the lesson to heart. So they were very aware of past precedents as serving as a warning. And that's one of the points you eloquently spoke in a very tragic themes, the fact of this grasping, exceeding the bounds. And then one of the whole points of tragedy is to, I think, convince people to check yourself. And so, no, I think they did try to do that. And like us, the audience didn't always listen.
I would like to read out an intervention by someone who's watching from Zoom. His name is Mr. Skoniti. So he says, thank you. I believe that Thucydides' trap cannot be avoided. It can only be predicted. The greater your strength, the more you'll be afraid of your neighbor. I am a middle-class person, and suddenly I win a large amount of money. Automatically, I'll start thinking that my neighbor is jealous and he wants something from me, or I will either do away with him or try to buy him out. I will not wait. And this is how the Americans behaved in Vietnam, Korea, and so on and so forth.
Remarks myself, yeah. Oh. Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much. Anyway. So we make a. Okay. Well, you take it. Can you see how many? Is there any statistic? Can we see how many are? Huh? Okay. If well, before. One is to continue the idea of Matthew. If in the case of war between Russia and Ukraine, we could have other things than the aggression of Putin towards Ukraine. I can testify you as being correspondent to Brussels in the end, from the beginning of 90s for several years, that until 2008 around, NATO did not exactly, it was not in position to justify not the expansion, but even its existence. It was difficult in NATO in the first years to explain to us, and I took part in some briefings by the general secretaries, etc., why NATO should go on. And of course, why to expand to other countries afterwards. Of course, this made things worse after 2008. It's not by coincidence that it was the date that Russia invaded Georgia. And another thing is, last week in my radio broadcast, taking the opportunity, not the opportunity, but the case of Turkey that withdraw from another convention covering the conventional weapons that there was signed in 1990, and everybody now is abandoning this convention. I had a specialist, and unfortunately, we put down a list of all treaties that are being abandoned or ineffective. So that's for you, Ms. Gavouneli. All the architecture of post-war, the post-Second World War and post-Cold War is being demolished. Changing is it's a nice word. I mean, is it possible to imagine in these conditions a new order? And we don't have only the traditional threats from nuclear weapons, conventional weapons. We have this coincidence, this new meeting of artificial intelligence and weapons. We saw it already in Gaza. Israel used it. Also, it's this unimaginable for the moment, but probably a case to weaponize space. We would need a treaty about all these things.
We do have a treaty. Yeah, plenty of treaties. Yes, we do have that treaty. Yeah, exactly. Not one, not just one, but the Outer Space Treaty is there already for quite some time.
Being applied or what?
Yes, it was, but you know, there were not many space powers so far, so we'll see how that goes. Well, let me go back to my original discussion. You've said earlier that already in ancient times, the states, the polis state, would actually understand that they were exceeding certain limits, and they would try, historians would try, the equivalent of civil society today, try to just draw them back. What they were lacking in antiquity and what we have today is actually international institutions. Because what was a prayer to the muse or to the goddess to help us all, basically, in antiquity, is today recourse to whatever it is that we have in place. What we have in place is what we have put in place, we the states. So it's not, again, it's not something that came from outer space, from God, from, you know, the little green things on Mars or whatever. So, you know, it's something that we have created. The mechanism that we have created post-Second World War operates, and we have seen it operating very well in a bipolar world. That's very clear. We have seen it working between the US and the Soviet Union. We have seen it working in a monopolar world in that brief window of opportunity when the US was omnipresent and omnipowerful. And nowadays, we see a decentralizing of the process. So we used to have what I called a vertical kind of distinction between the world. You used to be either with the free world, which means that you were actually a capitalist in economy, that you would have a freedom of expression within your society, that you would vote freely, that you would go for certain things, certain values. And on the other hand, you would have a communist state with state-controlled economy, and you would follow the whole package. So it's either the Western package or the Soviet package, but it was a package. Nowadays, we see more and more a sort of horizontal layering. So yes, China can be a communist state, but with an open economy. So it's not a package deal anymore. There are more and more states in Africa that would align themselves with China for a specific reason, infrastructure or something like that, but they would still vote merrily with the West in the UN. And they would also receive perhaps money or military support from Russia, things that have been unthinkable in the past. Our world, therefore, has become multipolar and totally decentralized, and our system is not built for that. There are no stabilizing mechanisms in that system. So inevitably, we change the system. There are two ways to do that. The first one is to change it from the beginning and, you know, scrap this and start again. It requires a war. Okay? Are you ready? I am not. But then again, nobody asked me. The other way is this slow process of transformation. We can see things moving. We can hear the mechanism sort of grinding along. We are too close right now to see the result. I would expect that in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, we would look back nowadays and we would say, what's that? There it was. It happened. We don't get it right now. We absolutely do not get it. We understand the small bits and pieces. 5 years ago, if somebody were to talk about energy, for instance, in this country, and suggest that we're going to revert the flow and Greece would become a net exporter of energy towards our northern neighbors, people would have died laughing, because it would have been inconceivable. Well, guess what? It happened almost overnight after Ukraine. It happened. It's new. It has changed. It has implications. But we're too close to understand that. So yes, the world is changing.
The Greeks did attempt some international mechanisms, binding arbitration from neutral third parties and so on. And yeah, and so I was going to bring, so they had the Amphictyonic Council, that was the group of states that agreed to protect the sanctity of Delphi. And when one of those states, when a state went rogue, the Phocians, they brought in someone to help enforce their rule. And that person was Philip of Macedonia, who took advantage of this international order to come in and, you know, conquer the entire country. So it's an interesting example.
Κύριος Πουκαμισάς.
Mr. Pukamisas.
An ex-ambassador.
Because there was no external balancer. The external balancer was Persia. Persia defeated. And at that point, the Greeks felt that they were able to carry the consequences of a fratricidal war. I mean, looking closer, I think that at the beginning, the Laconians, the Spartans had right. Which one? Athens was expanding power, and I think, okay. And at that point, they started to build or to upgrade the long walls, the walls connecting Athens with Piraeus. In this case, Athens would have the shield, and they would also have the spear. The spear would be to bring to revolt the Ilotes of Messenia or even of Laconia. And that was an existential threat for the Laconians. They were speaking and they were dealing in terms of power, of balance of power. They felt that balance of power was distorted against them, and they started building there were countless, let's say, countless, how you say, causes, not causes. Αυτό που λέμε in Greek, αφορμή.
Causes. Pretext, causes.
Pretext. No, not exactly pretext. Not just pretext. Okay, immediate reasons, let's call it, for the sake of discussion. I mean, Megarian edict, the war among in Corfu or north of Corfu, and other incidents. The Potidaika, and I mean, there have been plenty of immediate concerns. But the reason is Sparta was afraid. One time, when I was in Washington, serving with the embassy, there was a lecture by Donald Kagan in Cosmos Club of Washington. And I dared to compare the issue of that concern concern of the Spartans vis-a-vis the Athenians around 432 BC with the clauses of the ABM Treaty. ABM Treaty, at that time, there was already a rumor that America gets out of the ABM treaty. ABM means anti-ballistic missile treaty. Once we have the shield, and you have the other guy has only the shield and you have the spare, you can attack him. I mean, there is always some, and there will always be in this in world affairs, I'm afraid. Professor Gavouneli stated that, of course, we have institutions, and Amphictyonian League was just a not very strong institution. It was just, it served mainly, I would say, religious or political issues related to religion. So it was different. This is the main difference in our era, is that we possess and we have, not always effective, but we have the international institutions at the center of whom, I mean, there is the UN, the Security Council, with all pros and cons. But in Antiquity, there was only balance of power. And apparently, at some point, the Laconians felt that the power, I mean, the balance was tilting towards Athens. Now, I don't believe that Athens lost because of overextension. There is the hubris, and there is the fact that at a critical point, they were lacking good administrators, good admirals, good generals. The fatal disaster of a continental power that was Laconia, Sparta, was not in a battlefield, but was in a naval battle, or halfway naval battle, somewhere at the mouth of Hellespont. And we see, I mean, it's erroneous, it's tragic, tragic irony. You had a continental power defeating a naval power in a naval battle, and that was the end. But I don't believe it was
defeating them with Persian money, buying their ships too.
Okay. Persian money, yes, to build the fleet, you mean? Yes, because they had taken advantage of the Greek weakness. But I have another question, straight to Professor Gavouneli. You are director of ELIAMEP. We are living in a real world, and Greece is faced with serious concerns. What would be your advice to the Greek government in the face of let's say, how to call it? I would just call it Turkish provocations. Okay, it's not exactly the $1 billion question.
Well, I don't advise the Greek government as ELIAMEP, full stop. But I do write occasionally in newspapers, so you can actually see what are my positions in this kind of thing. And I speak as an international lawyer and as an academic here, who has also 20 years of experience in negotiations. So I'm not entirely in my ivory tower. The most difficult period that this country has encountered with our neighbors, I think, was the period when we were not talking to each other. That really meant that we were also fighting it out in the Aegean, in the Eastern Mediterranean, playing hide and seek. But it was not the playing of hide and seek that was difficult. We have done that before. I'm sure we're going to do it again. It was the not talking to each other. We ended up with a kind of rhetoric that I have never encountered before in all my years. I remember a particular situation in Edirnes, in Arnopoulos, on being invited on the other side of the border to discuss migration. And I do remember a series of meetings over lunch, dinner, breakfast, or whatever, where would be several people around the table, and there would be the local authorities, the mayor, the governor, the whomever, who would go, "You would know that we're coming at night. You personally." Are you? I mean, we might smile, we might consider that that was really over the top, that was too theatrical or whatnot, but let me tell you, it was not pleasant. And that really creates the risk. So I would argue always for talking to each other. We might agree to disagree at the end of the day. There might be some issues that cannot be resolved at the end of the day. Things happen, but we need to talk to each other.
Okay. Yeah, but I must take another question from my lady. Also, I said I must read another question in Zoom. Someone, Mrs. Antoniadou, writes, Ουκρανία, Ρωσία, όπως Αθήνα, Σπάρτη, Ισραήλ, Παλαιστίνη. Αυτό μόνο. You? Please. And Matthew, you answer both.
Okay. Thank you so much for everything so far. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I just wanted to shift a little bit in terms of how we've been conceptualizing the state and thinking about it, as well as geographically, to think a little bit more about Canada as a nation state and sort of warfare, conflict, diplomacy, and human rights within a nation. So, for example, I'm thinking about Canada, the federal government as a state negotiating with the Indigenous peoples, the First Nations, right, as well as the Inuit, Métis people. We might also add Quebec as a nation state and potentially even thinking about the Catholic Church and the Pope in the Vatican in terms of this ongoing conversation between Canada and Indigenous peoples. And just wondering what you think there can be reflections from Thucydides and what we could learn within Canada and similar nations who are dealing with different kind of notions of statehood and nationalism within our own borders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lana. That was a very interesting and challenging question. Obviously, I would say that initially the Canadian state, such as it is, treated the Indigenous population like the Athenians treated the Melians, if not far worse, because they didn't even give them the benefit of having a parley or an actual negotiation. And I think one of the prime things to come out of movements like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and so on is that Indigenous peoples want to be treated as if they're dealing with the federal government on a nation-to-nation basis. And this is where these things like these structures come into play, because obviously, in terms of raw power, the federal government in Ottawa does not have the need to treat a tiny reserve as a nation on par with dealing with, you know, its traditional diplomatic conversation partners. But I think part of adopting a set of norms would be, I think, two things. Actually, despite the power and population and wealth imbalances, treating each other as a nation-to-nation partner, as the Indigenous peoples have requested and in fact demanded, and I think rightly so. But also part of that system must be that Indigenous peoples must also have a voice in establishing the terms of that nation-to-nation, instead of, you know, being invited to take part in an apparatus that they had nothing to do with creating. And I think that would be how we apply a Thucydidean approach, in the sense that even though you don't have to in terms of realpolitik or power politics right now, it's the right thing to do. And because things change, it also, I think, will lead to more just outcomes for more people, including the currently powerful, if we engage on those kinds of bases. So as I'm thinking through, again, it's very challenging, but I would, yes, so the two things would be genuinely working on a nation-to-nation basis and allowing even the weaker nation to be partners in setting the terms of the discussion and the apparatus for having that discussion in the first place.
Can the audience comment on? I kindly disagree. Again, I'm not a professor. It's okay, you can hear me. Okay, I appreciate it. Like I said, I agree. Actually, I don't agree. Athenians had nothing similar what they did to Mytilene, which is a city of Lesbos, from what I understand. Anyway, I was going to go into a joke. That is two islands in Greece. Anyway, Athenians, very, very dissimilar. The Athenians did not steal the children like the Canadians. I'm a Canadian, like the Canadians did with the indigenous people. Canadians took the children of the indigenous people from Vancouver, stole them, and they brought them all the way to the other side of Canada. I'm very proud to be Canadian, but this is probably the worst thing that Canada has ever done. And I don't know if we have apologized. I don't know if we apologize through casinos, but this is something that needs to happen. As you can tell, I'm very, very passionate on this issue. No, Athenians that never did anything to equate what we Canadians did to the indigenous people. Sorry.
No, but I would agree in principle with the fact that I think the genocide of indigenous peoples is like a world historically unique. And I'm trying to make analogies, but I would not suggest that as atrocious as certain wartime actions and peacetime actions that ancient Greeks did. And there are probably things that approach that level of brutality, but in terms of a systematic continent-wide genocide, no, the Greeks didn't have the capacity or the opportunity to do anything on that scale. I would agree with you there.
There's someone in the back. I cannot see easily, but
hello. Your speeches up till now have been extremely good. Before your speech, you mentioned as well in some questions from the audience, some things about history. You mentioned that those who don't study history, who don't keep up with it, are bound to repeat it. I believe that's not the end of the sentence. And I am of the opinion of that not only are those who don't keep up with history bound to repeat it, but those who keep up with history are bound to watch it happen all over again. Do you agree or disagree? Thank you.
I agree. Yes. As a history teacher, and someone who reads the news, we smack our heads all the time because they're doing it again. And one of the things I continue to say is, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Gaza, the rhetoric is always, well, this war, this is a righteous war, and this war is a good war. This time we're going to get it right. And this time we're not going to have to fight again. We just have to fight this one more war. And obviously it's never true. And I think you're right.
παρακαλώ. Και μετά ο κύριος. Γιατί ξαναμίλησε.
Thank you. I would like to all congratulate you actually on all the elements that you gave us from perspective of your discipline of each one of you. Actually, what I would like to mention, there is a holistic difference between our world and the ancient world. What led to international institutions? The very fact that we reached the brink of pure extension of the whole world. Now, I don't consider it being the fact, at least in the mind of Athenians or the Spartans at the time, that they would erase entirely the adverse city-state from the world. It was never the case. They always wanted something else, more soil, more resources. It has always been something to obtain. Now, what led us to international institutions and international law? Yes, that very brink of extinction. So we had to do something about it, because otherwise we would not be here standing to speak. Still, now I do consider, setting back a little bit, one step behind, is that we have reached, through this multipolarism that has actually developed ever since, is that we have to somehow set aside this very notion of law and go towards relations. And I explain myself. We have not been talking about, there are new notions of artificial intelligence, but also misinformation, disinformation, and the so-called new wording of narratives. Now I see that bigger states, smaller states, they hide behind their own finger, as we say in Greek, and is how they want to present their very notion of going to war, not even saying that this is a war. To begin with, the very fact of the very definition of war is not being even addressed to or acknowledged, or we have started having argumentations. Is there a war? Should there be war? What is the reason of the war? Each state does not want even to acknowledge that what the situation is. For example, for my perspective, because I am a career diplomat now, I was shocked to the extent that an embassy was hit, setting aside the justification and what was there inside the embassy or whatever, but still we are going backwards. I do believe that this is a setback against international law, because international law has to develop. Does it have to adapt to the new surrounding, diplomatic relations included? And this is what my greatest fear is. I'm sorry to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow. What is misinformation that was not actually included in 1984, which incidentally was written in 1948? When we were talking about newspeak, when we were talking about a different way of suggesting that truth is not truth anymore. What is different? Technology might be different, but the notions behind it are pretty much the same. So it's not something that one needs to get surprised so much. We evolve. The difference between the ancient world, the classic world, the world of the discoveries, was that there was more world to explore and exploit. We have now reached the point where we cannot move further because our world is finite. We do have a major problem, and that's an existential problem at this point. That's climate change. So nature is after us because we have been after nature. And we need to readjust our thinking, and we need to readjust our institutions and our rules and regulations, the way we do business. Why? Because now we might end up with these kind of decentralized arrangements, but we operate on the same level, and that same level involves all of us. You said that perhaps we should not talk about law and we should talk about relations, but law is relations. Law is actually a method, it's of conduct. Law instructs us on how to do business, how to operate in our environment. And of course, it adds the question of sanctions next to that, just to make it viable and to make it feasible at the end of the day, because otherwise we would just live in the world of exhortations. We just go and make sure that Delphi is well protected, and may the god Apollo help us all. So we need to just put a little bit of teeth, if you like, to our arrangements. Our rules have not changed, that they need to be adjusted to reality. The use of the words is there for a reason. The reason we don't say, Russia, for instance, does not say that we are at war with Ukraine, means that they don't want to acknowledge that they are in breach of a rule that says no use of force, and therefore no war. And second, that they don't want to be bound by humanitarian law that kicks into force when war is around. There is a reason for that. The reason people do not acknowledge it when they go and bomb embassies, and it has happened repeatedly, is simply because the moment they do so, they would also acknowledge that they are in breach of a rule. And if they are in breach of a rule, then there must be a sanction to that. So it happened. The embassy was bombed. But nobody has actually come forward saying, we did it. And since nobody has come forward saying we did it, there's nobody to attach a sanction to. We all know who did it, but there has been no formal acknowledgement. So once you get over the threshold of use of force, then our rules say that we have an inherent right of self-defense that kicks in. So the moment you acknowledge that you have actually used force, the other guy can actually use force as well. And then you go up and up and up and up, you escalate, and you end up with a world war in your hands. And the Macedonian phalanx would actually kill very effectively and very efficiently, but they would kill what, 100 people? Nowadays, we can push a button and kill some millions, okay? So there is a difference. Words matter. And in international law, words matter even more because they have baggage behind it. So we use the words with caution, and we choose not to use them occasionally because that might make a difference.
Matthew, a final answer and maybe a comment, closing comment.
I also struggle with whether we're in a new world with misinformation, with the speed and reach of media. But I also, even before 1984, Thucydides in the Corcyraean Civil War makes the statement that words change their meanings. And he talks about how even in that war in 427 or 428 BCE, that the strain of war and the different factions going against each other meant that they just flagrantly used words in incorrect and deliberately distorting ways. They didn't have TikTok, but it had similar effects, at least at a local level. And so that would be one instance where I think that is a common casualty. And every time I visit a World War II museum, for example, what I find the most moving parts of those museums are when they have an exhibition of the wartime propaganda. If you want to think about using words, I mean, look at how the Japanese were represented in American public life, just openly. And so I think words do matter and words are important. And that's why people distort them so much, because they wouldn't bother with it if it didn't matter. And I think laying claim to and refusing to budge on the words, I think, is a kind of our responsibility and a way to mitigate that. And I think that's one of the lessons to draw it back to Thucydides that he was, I think, suggesting.
Matthew Sears, who came all over New Brunswick to Athens, and Mrs. Gavouneli, professor of international law in the Athenian University and general secretary of ELIAMEP, and of course, Mr. Veremis, who left. We thank you all. Stay for, it's Mr. Jacques.
I also thank you all. I thank our distinguished guest. Some come from farther than others, but all were equally interesting. Thank you to Polydefkis and to all the members of the Institute that helped us. It was a nice experience. Join us all for a glass of wine, and we continue discussing around that. Thank you very much, everybody.